In the June referendum on whether or not the United Kingdom should leave the European Union, a small majority of the population decided that we should leave the European Union, so-called Brexit. As economists, we're still not quite sure what the effect will be on the economy because we're still not quite sure what Brexit means. The referendum question was simply, should we leave the European Union? But it wasn't specified what relationship we should have with the European Union once we'd left. In the very short run, the financial markets were severely disturbed, and that means that sterling has fallen 16% against the dollar, and the FTSE 250, the stock market index which most closely represents British medium-sized firms, is now 6% down on where it was a year ago. But there was no financial crisis. The Bank of England took measures to ensure that there was enough liquidity available to banks, and therefore we have avoided a financial crisis of the nature of the one we had in 2008. The long-run impact is quite difficult to specify for two reasons. It's likely that there will be less trade between the United Kingdom and the rest of the European Union, because the whole point about leaving the European Union is that there must be some separation of the markets. Estimating the effect of trade on GDP and GDP growth is quite difficult for economists, because we are not allowed to do natural experiments. And therefore what happens is that when we look in the past data, we know that when countries trade with each other more, their GDP growth tends to go up. But we're uncertain whether countries who would have grown more quickly anyway choose to start trading more. So there's a question of causation in both directions. Using the best estimates that we have, using advanced econometric techniques, we think that overall the United Kingdom is likely to have GDP several percentage points lower than it would have had if it had remained within the European Union. But the other area of uncertainty is that we have no idea what the relationship will be between the UK and the rest of the EU. One possibility is that we have the Norwegian option, where we still have access to the single market and still have free movement of labour. The problem with that solution is that during the referendum campaign it was quite clear that immigration was a major concern of many people, and therefore they are unlikely to want an option which allows continued immigration from the EU. Alternatively, we could have a solution closer to the Canadian solution, where Britain still has access to the single market, but only in certain goods and not in services, which would affect financial services such as banking and the City of London, but that would satisfy the demands of people who wanted there to be no free movement of labour. Until the politicians are able to form a government and to start negotiations, it's really very difficult to say what effect there will be on trade, and therefore very difficult to say what effect there will be on GDP. The other issue, of course, is that GDP is not quite the same as living standards for most people in the United Kingdom. Over the last 20 or so years, while GDP per person has gone up, living standards of people in the poorest half of the population have gone up much more slowly. For example, the mean income has gone up by about 7 percentage points over the last decade, but median income, the income of the person in the middle of the UK population, has only gone up by 5 percentage points. And if we take out pensioners, the income of the median British household has gone up by about 0 percentage points over the last decade. So this means that for many people, any estimates that we have of GDP changes as a result of leaving the European Union tell us very little about the effects on their living standards. This may be one reason why so many people voted against remaining in the European Union, because they perceived that rising inequality led to them having no stake in all of the advantages that come from being EU members. More narrowly, I'd like now to turn briefly to the effect on universities. British universities are very international and have very large numbers of international staff, both from within the European Union and from outside. It's quite likely that many members of staff who are here will stay, but we may have greater difficulty recruiting staff from overseas because they're uncertain about what will happen. Also, many research initiatives are international in nature, and because academics are very competitive and have to commit themselves to long-run research projects, they may be unhappy about committing themselves to long-run projects with UK universities if there is uncertainty over whether research funding will continue. The UK is a large net recipient of research funding from the European Union, and at the moment there is complete uncertainty about whether that funding will continue. There are anecdotal stories that already British people are finding European partners unwilling to put in for research grants for future research projects. There's also a big effect on students. We have a very large international student body in the United Kingdom, many coming from the European Union either as students on degrees full-time or as Erasmus students. We have very little idea whether the Erasmus scheme will continue, and certainly whether or not it will continue in its present form. Britain has tended to have more European students coming into the UK as Erasmus students than we send abroad, and therefore it is quite likely that the UK government may wish to restrict those numbers as a way of keeping immigration numbers down. It might sound as if, as an economist, I'm saying there's a lot of uncertainty and I can say very little about what will happen in the future. But part of the problem at the moment is that we are very dependent upon the decisions of politicians, and at the moment, as I speak, the United Kingdom is in the process of moving from one Prime Minister to another. So we shall have to see what the politicians decide and what they're able to negotiate with European Union politicians before we can say with more certainty what the effects will be.